Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah ma ba'd. We welcome you, inshallah ta'ala, to the resumption of our series, which is the top 50 hadith that every Muslim should know, inshallah ta'ala. And tonight is hadith number 30 that we will continue from. So, alhamdulillah, we've been able to finish almost 20. And now we are on hadith number 30. It's a blessed hadith. In fact, it's a very comprehensive hadith and a very important one. And it will help, learning this hadith will help a lot of Muslims kind of identify overarching rules and guidelines and regulations to live by, inshallah ta'ala, in their own lives. And that way they can go from there, inshallah ta'ala. So to proceed, what is the hadith? The hadith itself is narrated by Abu Tha'laba al-Kushanee radiyallahu anhu, where he says, عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إن الله فرض فرائض فلا تضيعوها وحد حدودا فلا تعتدوها وحرم أشياء فلا تنتهكوها وسكت عن أشياء رحمة لكم من غير نسيان فلا تبحثوا عنها. حديث حسن رواه الدارقطني وغيره. So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he says at the very end, we'll of course translate it, but he says at the very end that this is a hadith that's hasan, it's acceptable, it's a sound hadith, that's narrated by Daraqutni and many others. We'll talk about, inshallah ta'ala, the authentication of this hadith. But first we will actually translate it. So it says, indeed Allah has farada fara'id. That means He has set obligations, things that are mandatory upon a Muslims. فَلَا تُضَيِّعُوهَا. Do not waste them away, meaning you have to do them. Don't neglect them. So, number one, your obligations, do not neglect. Number two, he says, وَحَدَّ حُدُودًا فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. And He has set boundaries, so do not transgress them. Do not go beyond the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set. So number one, we have obligations. Number two, we have boundaries that bound us together, that bound us within limits. These limits, these are, we can translate them as red lines that we should not go beyond. Okay? So that's number two. Number three, وَحَرَّمَ أَشْيَاءَ فَلَا تَنْتَهِكُوهَا. And He has forbidden certain things, so do not desanctify them, do not transgress, do not take them. So there are certain things that are forbidden, don't go and do these things that are forbidden. Then category number four, which is وَسَكَتَ عَنْ أَشْيَاءَ رَحْمَةً لَكُمْ مِنْ غَيْرِ نِسْيَانٍ فَلَا تَبْحَثُوا عَنْهَا. And then category number four, which is arguably the most controversial out of the four, he says, and He was quiet, He was silent about things, not out of forgetfulness, but out of mercy for you. So do not search for them. And that's the end of the hadith. So the fourth category is, there are things in which Islam, and when we say Islam, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His book, the Prophet in His sunnah, are quiet, they're silent about. They haven't said anything, there's nothing on this issue. And He says, رَحْمَةً لَكُمْ مِنْ غَيْرِ نِسْيَانٍ, meaning it's out of mercy for you, not out of forgetfulness. Meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself is not forgetful. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كَانَ رَبُّكَ نَسِيًّا. Your Lord was not a forgetful Lord. And it says, do not search for them. So this hadith can be confusing unless we clarify certain things and certain guidelines, inshallah ta'ala, to apply this. But we'll go from here, inshallah ta'ala. So first, this hadith is not narrated in one of the 6 books. There are versions of it that are in the 6 main books of hadith. But this hadith in its wording is narrated by Daraqutni and also by Al-Hakim and by Al-Bazzar, with different wordings here and there. At-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, rahimahumullah, they narrate also other similar hadith to this effect. All in all, this hadith is hasan, so it's not up to the authenticity level of sahih, meaning completely we can say, affirmatively, but it's an acceptable hadith. And in fact, many scholars have actually praised this hadith, and by doing so, when praising it, of course, they mentioned that this hadith, the scholars who praise it, they said that this hadith, really for us, if you apply this hadith, you are number one, going to get a lot of reward because you're doing that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated. We talked about this before. And then number two, you're safe from Allah's punishment. Why? Because you're not transgressing the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set, number one. And then number two, you're not doing the things that He has prohibited us from doing. And inshallah ta'ala, what we will do next is take some time to look into every single one of these categories, inshallah ta'ala, and go over anything that we can get. Right? Number one, He says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ فَرَضَ fara'id. Indeed, Allah has set certain things that are obligations. So there are obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts from us, or expects from us. Now, Islamically speaking, we know what our obligations are. Almost every Muslim automatically knows what the obligations are. This is what's fard. And a person might also, the question comes up, is there a difference between that which is fard and that which is wajib? So this is the question. Is there a difference between fard and wajib? And this is one of those terms that's used in Islamic studies in usul, generally speaking, when they are separated, meaning if I say this is fard and if I say this is wajib, without mentioning both words, meaning if they're separate, they generally mean the same thing. This is like me saying, oh, this, ayyuhal mu'minun. If I'm talking, I'm giving a speech like, oh believers, and then I give the speech. Or I say, oh Muslims, I give the speech. Do I mean different people when I say, oh believers or oh Muslims? I do not. But when I mention believers and Muslims together, then they actually do mean separate things. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alludes to this very subtly, and this is one of those subtle things that's in the Quran, where when talking about the story of the angels who visited Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he asks them, this is in Surat, it's going to come to me. The angels come to him, and they visit him, they're talking to him, and he asks them, قَالَ فَمَا خَطْبُكُمْ أَيُّهَا الْمُرْسَلُونَ. This is the beginning of the juz, actually, number 26. And they said, we have been sent for قالوا إِنَّا أُرْسِلْنَا إِلَىٰ قَوْمٍ مُجْرِمِينَ لِنُرْسِلَ عَلَيْهِمْ حِجَارَةً مِّن طِينٍ مُسَوَّمَةً عِندَ رَبِّكَ لِلْمُسْرِفِينَ. And then they said, and this is where the difference comes in, فَأَخْرَجْنَا فِيهَا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. We took out all of the believers, al-mu'mineen. And then they clarified, and they said, فَمَا وَجَدْنَا فِيهَا غَيْرَ بَيْتٍ مِّنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. We only found one house of Muslims there. So here he's mentioning together, he says, we took out all the believers, but only found one house of Muslims. But why didn't he say a house of believers? He used the word believers, so why not use it again? And the answer is, when I'm talking Muslims is a more general concept than believers. Because of the hadith of Jibreel, the Prophet ﷺ made it so that to qualify as a believer is a more narrow definition than that of a Muslim. Muslim is a very broad category. Anybody who does the outward practices of Islam is a Muslim, regardless of what's inside. But then as a believer, a mu'min, it's more dictated by believing in those 6 pillars of Iman, on top of doing the outward actions of the 5 pillars of Islam. So because of this, it turns out that in the house, of course, who is he talking about? There's only one house of Muslims in the whole people, that whole village, and it was the house of Lut alayhi salam, right? But it was because his wife was not a believer herself, but she's in the house. He just said a house of Muslims. Why? Because outwardly it appeared that she was probably a Muslim too. But inwardly, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew her fate, and this is why she was punished with the rest of her, the people, the disbelievers that were there. So this is why they said, فَأَخْرَجْنَا فِيهَا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. We took out all of the believers, so the believers were saved. But that house, because, here's the thing, a society, any society, a Muslim society, contains al-fajr wal-mu'min. And it contains people who are doing sins, people who are not committing sins, people who are doing good deeds and righteous. But we call the whole society as a whole, as a Muslim society, even if it contains people who might not be believers. We won't necessarily call a whole society believers. So, with that said, this idea of using 2 terms, technically they're slightly different. But when I use them separately, they mean generally the same thing. So if I say this is wajib, this is fard, generally it's the same thing. Now, this is our modern definition that we use because of the way that scholars over the years have defined it for us. But now I'm going to introduce a concept, right, of naming things as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has named them and as the Prophet ﷺ has named them. And why do we mention this? because they have used words to describe things that we might not think of as wajib, or might not think of as fard. Meaning, these definitions that we use as fard or wajib, what I'm going to introduce here, are slightly different than even the Prophet ﷺ himself's definition. Now, is it correct for us to define these terms differently than the Prophet ﷺ defined them? It could be. And in fact, the scholars did. Why did they do this? Because it's convenient for us to categorize things in ways that help us practice Islam. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ, his role was both a preacher, meaning he's trying to preach and to get people to do what's right, but he was also a legislator, in the sense that he's telling us what's right and what's wrong. Generally speaking, legislators are not admonishers at the same time. People who set rules and guidelines, generally if you read any book of laws or guidelines, are going to be very dry and technical. And so the Prophet ﷺ is technical, but at the same time is also admonishing, which means there's going to be exaggerations, there's going to be hyperbole, there's going to be language that's colorful, etc. He's going to be laysa minna man, he is not from us who does 1, 2, and 3. That's and sometimes we think that it means, okay, this person who does that is not a Muslim. When in fact the Prophet ﷺ doesn't mean it that way. Like a technical definition, it's meant to admonish you from staying from something like this. I'll give an example that'll clear it up. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, غسل يوم الجمعة واجب على كل محتلم. This is an authentic hadith. It's narrated in both Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. We know this hadith because we apply it. What does the hadith say? It says the shower, the bathing of the day of Friday, meaning for Surat Al-Jum'ah, is wajib upon every adult. محتلم هنا بمعنى أنه وصل سن البلوغ. Okay, so he says it's wajib. So I hear the word wajib and I'm like, oh, that means it's mandatory. That means I have to shower every Friday. ليس هناك شك. Yani there's no doubt, because the Prophet ﷺ says the word wajib. But guess what? There's not a single scholar in Islamic history who ever said that it's actual fard, that you have to take a shower on the day of Friday. In fact, not even the companions themselves understood it this way. In fact, that's where we get it from. We get it from the actions of the companions themselves. In fact, the actions of the Prophet ﷺ himself. We have some narrations that mention that the Prophet ﷺ went out to Friday without showering. We have some narrations where Uthman ibn Affan, as an example, and there's others as well, he comes late to Jum'ah during the time of Umar. And Umar is like, why are you late? He's like, I'm late. He's like, did you even shower? He says, I didn't even shower. And Umar doesn't kick him out. He doesn't say, oh no, you have to go shower because your salah won't be accepted unless you shower, because the Prophet ﷺ said. He knows the hadith, but he also knows how it was applied. And so Uthman comes and he sits down without having showered, and nobody admonished him. In fact, nobody said a thing. Which tells us that the companions understood that even though the Prophet ﷺ is saying the word wajib, it's not the wajib that we understand. What the Prophet ﷺ is saying, that it's highly recommended. It should not be left unless there are extraneous circumstances. And even then there's no blame, insha'Allah ta'ala. And here extraneous circumstances doesn't mean it doesn't fall into the category of, you're on the verge of death or something along these lines. It's not an emergency situation. It's just, I didn't have time. And even if the person had time and he didn't shower, is there any blame upon them for leaving it? Not a single scholar has ever said that there's any blame upon a person who does not shower for the day of Friday, even if he had the time and energy to actually shower. So, coming back to this idea, and by the way, when we say shower here, we mean to take the full body ghusl. You know what I mean? We say shower just because that's what everybody does these days. But that's the idea. Okay? The language here now that's used is used in a way that we later Muslims might not fully understand unless we take it within the context, which is why, we have to kind of understand where things sit. And this is why later scholars realized that the Prophet ﷺ would say this is wajib. And that, by the way, this is one example. There's actually other examples where the Prophet ﷺ uses the word wajib without meaning that it's fard. And similar to this is Salatul Witr. Witr, he actually uses the word wajib, right? Now, is it wajib, is it fard? Many new Muslims would come and he would only teach them 5 prayers a day, and he never told them they have to pray more upon this. And there's not a single punishment that's mentioned for the person who neglects Salat al-Witr. لَيْسَتْ هُنَاكَ عُقُوبَةٌ مُخَصَّصَةٌ لِمَنْ تَرَكَ صَلَاةَ الْوِتْرِ. So, is it at the same level of the 5 daily prayers? No. Now, are the 5 daily prayers fard? Yes, they are. And we know this, right? Every Muslim knows this. We don't doubt this idea. However, is Salat al-Witr at the same level? No, it's not. But do we say that it's wajib? So here's the thing. The Ahnaf, generally speaking, differentiated between fard and wajib, even when they're mentioned separately. And what did they say? They say that the fard is that, and here's the thing, there's actually 2 or 3 definitions. So one is that they said that the fard is that which if you neglect, there's a punishment. But the wajib is that which if you neglect, there's no necessarily punishment, but you have to still do it. So you're compelled the same to do it, but there's punishment in one, there's no punishment in the other. And that's the difference. Some have said, الفرض ما وجدناه في كتاب الله والواجب ما وجدناه في سنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So they said, fard is that which we find in the book of Allah, wajib is that which we find in the sunnah of His Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم. However, you'll find that this definition also has some issues, because there are some things that are mentioned in both, and some things that are mentioned in one but clarified in the other, like in the sunnah. And then sometimes the Prophet ﷺ himself will use the word fard. This is why some scholars have said, we will call whatever Allah and His Messenger have said fard, that's what we're going to call it fard as well. And if they call something wajib, we're going to call it wajib as well. But then remember, even that definition will lead us to having that problem where what the Prophet ﷺ meant by wajib, for example, in the showering on the day of Friday, is not necessarily what comes to mind when we think of wajib. كَوُجُوب الصَّلَوَاتِ الْخَمْسِ, like the wajib of the 5 daily prayers. This is why there's scholars of other madhahib, like al-Shafi'iyya or al-Hanabila, they have the category of sunnah mu'akkada, an established sunnah. So, it would be that ghusl yawm al-Jum'ah is a sunnah mu'akkada. Salat al-Witr is sunnah mu'akkada. Why do they say that it's sunnah mu'akkada? Because they say this is an established sunnah. By sunnah here, they don't mean optional. They mean that it's an established, act of worship or deed that the Prophet ﷺ would do. And that if the person not neglects the actual deed once or twice or whatever, but neglects it completely as if he doesn't care for it, doesn't do it, that is when he's under the threat of punishment. Meaning just not doing it, there's no punishment for it itself. But there could be a punishment for neglecting a well-established sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Which is why this category of sunnah mu'akkada in reality mirrors what the Ahnaf would call wajib. And so this is where some confusion happens. We're naming the same thing. In fact, if you look at the definitions, they're almost the same, but we're giving them different names. This is why the madhahib, once you actually study, are actually very closer than they seem to appear in reality. And this only happens, after you look at some of these things, inshaAllah ta'ala. So, with that said, we wanted to, mention how there are terms that were given to things that might not match what we understand, and also on the other side. Because of this, there were many scholars who would be fearful of labeling things a label beyond the label given to them by Allah and His Messenger. Even on the issue of wajib. But let's even take it to the issue of haram. Remember, because the hadith, it mentions 4 categories. Fara'id, muharramat, hudud, and maskut anhu. So fara'id, the obligations, mentions those, the hudud, it actually mentions the boundaries, and then it mentions the haram, and then it mentions things that we're silent about. Let's talk about the haram. Because the issue of haram, usually haram is mentioned in opposition to fard. So from an usuli point of view, if we look at usul al-fiqh, the definition of fard is the following. That which, if a Muslim does, he gets rewarded for by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's commanded to. And that which, if he does not do, he is promised a punishment. Not definitively, because punishments are never definitive. Reward is always definitive. Okay? So the definition of fard is that which if you do, you get rewarded, and if you neglect, you don't do, then you are promised, there's a promise of punishment. There's a potential for it. Why? Because هو تحت المشيئة. إن شاء الله عذبه وإن شاء غفر له. If he does it, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yani if he doesn't do it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can choose to punish him. And if he does it, of course, then he gets reward. Inshallah ta'ala. So that's the definition of fard. The definition of something that's sunnah or mustahab, what we use here, sunnah now in the usuli sense, is that which if a person does, he gets reward, and if he neglects, there's nothing. لَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ أَيْ لَوْمٍ. Now the definition of haram, on the very opposite of the extreme, is that which if you do, there's a clear, there's a wa'id, which means a promise of punishment. You're under a threat of punishment. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to, He'll punish you for doing it. And if He wants to, you won't be punished. But it's under Allah's will. But if you leave it, you don't do it, you're rewarded. So the definition of haram is, if I leave it, I'm rewarded. If I do it, I'm under the threat of a punishment. There's a potential for there. Okay? And this is why the definition of makruh is similar to this, except we remove one part, which is, if you avoid it, you're rewarded. Fil makruh. If you don't do it, you're rewarded. Why? Because you chose to do it for the sake of Allah. Meaning, I'm avoiding it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you do it, there's no blame whatsoever. And then the definition of halal, which is where if you do it or don't do it, it's the same. Doesn't matter. Generally speaking. Of course, these are all general categories. Each specific deed that the person does could vary between these. In fact, the same deed could have all five depending on the situation. An example of this is like marriage. For one person, marriage is fard. Okay, why? Why is it fard? Because if he does not get married, he could actually commit sin. And he probably is committing a sin until he actually gets married. So for him, marriage is fard. For another person, marriage is sunnah. Why? Because it follows the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because it's recommended, it'll help him avoid sin, but he's not falling into sin right now. For another person, it's halal. He might be already married, or for him, marriage won't help him that. He's already well taken care of, alhamdulillah, or whatever. And for him, it could be halal. And there could be another person, a fourth person, who for him, marriage is makruh. He might not be able to fulfill the rights of his wife to the extent that she needs. And she might be willing to say, okay, I don't need this, I don't need that from you, kada. But even then, it's obviously highly recommended that if he had the capability, he could. So for some person, it could be makruh. And for another person, the last category, it could be haram for him to get married. Because there's no way that he can ever aslan fulfill her rights. And for him, marriage is haram. Now, do I know this? Like if I meet a person and I say, for you, marriage is haram, not right off the get-go. So I don't want anybody to then hear this, that there could be people who, for them, marriage is haram, to go and then start labeling somebody who's trying to get married and say, for you, marriage is haram because the sheikh said so. No, we didn't say this. But what we're saying is, the same deed could have all different 5 categories applied to it. And that's the basic idea. So, many scholars, historically, when they were asked about halal and haram, they would be very scared to use these labels. Especially when they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not use the label, or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not use the label. We have an example, many examples. Imam Malik rahimahullah, he says, أَكْرَهُ أَنْ أَقُولَ حَلَالًا أَوْ حَرَامًا. He says, I do not like to say that this is halal and this is haram. Right? This is Ibn Wahb. He says, سمعت مالك بن أنس يقول أدركت علماءنا يقول أحدهم إذا سئل أكره هذا ولا أحبه ولا يقول حلالا أو حراما. He says, so when his own teachers were asked about a certain thing, they would said, لا يعجبني لا أحب هذا أكره هذا. This is what they would say. Meaning, I like this, I don't like it. But they wouldn't say halal and haram. Why? Because that is a ruling that they're almost speaking on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why there's a scholar, his name is Al-Rabi', he says, لِيَتَّقِ أَحَدُكُمْ أَنْ يَقُولَ أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ كَذَا وَحَرَّمَ اللَّهُ كَذَا فيقول الله كذبت لم أحل كذا ولم أحرم كذا. Al-Rabi', he says, I do not like it that a person says, Allah has forbidden this or Allah has allowed this, because it's as if he's speaking on behalf of Allah. Rather, he says, I like it when the scholar says, this is recommended, this is not recommended. And this is why sometimes when we read historical books, books meaning written historically about halal and haram and whatnot, it might be confusing because you'll find that the scholar says, akrahu hada, and I dislike this. And a person might think that, oh, it means that this is makruh, where in fact it's actually haram. But he is not using that word haram just out of fear of completely speaking on behalf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or on behalf of His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. There is a statement by, not a statement, there's an incident that happened to Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, where he was asked about a certain issue. And of course, there was a man there, his name is, it's narrated by Ibn Abi Dakhila, and it's his father, so Abu Dakhila, he was there. كان بحضرة ابن عمر. And Ibn Umar, he says, نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الزبيب والتمر يعني أن يخلطا. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade zabib and tamr. Zabib is raisins, tamr is of course the dates, that they should be mixed in terms of selling them. Right, to increase the weight, people would like this, wouldn't like this, etc. He says, meaning they should be sold separately, and then if a person wants to mix them later on, they can do that. But to sell them as their own item, not as a combined thing, because then the prices could change, and it was a form of manipulation. So, he said, فَقُلْتُ. So he said this, he said, نَهَا. Right, this is the word that he used. So he said, نَهَا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن التمر عن الزبيب والتمر يعني أن يخلطا. فقال لي رجل من خلفي. So Abu Dakhila, he says, there was a man behind me. ما قال, what did he say? He's asking, what did he say? فقلت, Abu Dakhila is saying, حرم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الزبيب والتمر. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم has said that zabib and tamr are haram. Okay? فقال عبد الله بن عمر كذبت. Abdullah ibn Umar now hears him narrating back what he said, and he said, no, you're lying. That's not what I said. فقلت ألم تقل نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فهو حرام. He said, so Abu Dakhila himself now is confused. He said, didn't you say that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade such and such? So it has to be haram. هو في ذهنه ساوى بين كلمة نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعن تحريم. So he says, أنت تشهد بذلك. Ibn Umar asks him, do you testify to this? Meaning to the fact that every time we hear Naha Rasulullah, that means it's haram. So even back then, they had this discussion where if the Prophet ﷺ said no to something, does that automatically mean it's haram? If the Prophet ﷺ says no to something, if you forbid something, does that automatically equal haram? فقال سلام كأنه يقول من نهي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أدب وليس للتحريم. So one of the narrators of this hadith, he says, it's as if Abdullah ibn Umar was teaching them that not every prohibition of the Prophet ﷺ means that it's actually explicitly haram. What it means in a lot of cases is it's adab, it's a merely mannerism. And obviously here, this is the case. He was forbidding this, he was telling them not to do this in order to manipulate the price. Now if a person has a dish, and the dish happens to have all these different types of fruit, like it's a fruit salad, and he says, oh wait, I came across this thing where it's forbidden. No, it's not forbidden. It's forbidden because of another reason. But even that forbiddance is because of perhaps the manipulation that could happen. So, and there's a lot of examples of this where people would ask, نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن كذا وكذا هل هو للتحريم أم لا? This is a big discussion in the books of usul, which is if the Prophet ﷺ says no to something, does that mean it's haram in all cases? Or does that even mean that it's haram in that even specific case? And it shows us even at that stage in early Islam, people like Abdullah ibn Umar were aware that not everything that the Prophet ﷺ says no to means that it's actually haram. Okay, so we have to realize this, that there's a difference between these types of things. Okay, so this teaches us that we as well should be very careful when throwing out labels like halal and haram, unless we have explicit proof to them. Now the question might be, what about a modern phenomenon? Something that never existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Something like, the other day I was talking to my students at the Islamic school, and they were saying, oh Sheikh, are cigarettes haram? Because I heard they're makruh. That's the only thing that we can say is that they're makruh, they're not haram. I said, okay, very good. Who said they're makruh? And the student said, Islam says that they're makruh. I'm like, who's Islam? What's his last name? She's like, no, like Islam, like the Quran and the Sunnah. I was like, but the Quran and the Sunnah don't speak. Like they don't, yani if I bring the Quran itself and I say, okay, Quran, go ahead and talk to me, tell me, he won't say anything. Or the Sunnah. It's the interpretation of the scholars. To what does that actually mean? Now, if something has never been mentioned before, what is the ruling upon this? So it's an ijtihad now that they do. And if they have explicit proof and they go through and they make the effort, then of course then it becomes very clear what the ruling is on this. That's why there was one scholar, he said, I have over 30 proofs for why smoking cigarettes is haram. Over 30. Not that it's makruh. Now, the one or two scholars, even though I'm looking for where this started, but assuming that it exists, or that it's from a legitimate scholar, who says that they are makruh, meaning cigarettes. The reasoning that they gave is that it was never explicitly mentioned in the Quran or the Sunnah as being haram, and so therefore we're doing the same thing Abdullah ibn Umar did, where because Allah Himself never said haram in the Quran and the Sunnah never said haram in the Quran or the Sunnah, we can't use that word either. And this is of course incorrect. We can use the word when applied correctly according to the definitions that we lay down in our usul. And when I say our, I don't mean like me myself, I'm not a scholar, but the scholars have generally done this. And this is why I told you, there's many books that have been written about it a long time ago, years and years and years ago, when people, you know what I mean, knew that cigarettes were actually very harmful, they were cancerous, they were causing all these problems, etc., that they were very haram. In fact, very famously, there was a man in front of a scholar, a sheikh. He said, I want to go buy some cigarettes. And he said, come here, how much are you going to spend on it? And he said, what, $10 or whatever? He said, okay, give me the $10. He gave it to him, and the sheikh burnt them right there. He burnt the $10, or whatever it was, the money. And the man is like, what are you doing? He's like, this is basically what you're going to do with the cigarettes. You're going to burn them. You're literally going to burn them, except that you're going to hurt your health. Here, I'm just burning it without hurting your health. Nobody got harmed in the process. It's basically the same thing. Of course, the man was shocked and surprised, but the sheikh is right. Now, obviously, that shock value maybe had an effect for this person. Other people, it might not have an effect. So I don't want anybody to go home if they have a relative or a friend who's smoking cigarettes and tell them, give me your money, I'll just burn it for you. And cause some problems and some issues. He had rapport with him, which is why he was able to do it. Going back, haram things are generally clear. Almost every Muslim, alhamdulillah, grows up knowing what is haram, what is halal. Generally speaking, it's very hard to find somebody who doesn't know really the very commonly well-known things that are haram. This is from the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Obviously between these two categories, meaning that which is fard and that which is haram, is a category of بَيْنَهُمَا أُمُورٌ مُشْتَبِهَاتٌ. Between them are doubtful manners. Meaning they're doubtful because the person doesn't have knowledge. It doesn't mean that they are actual doubts. And we'll get to that hadith. That's a hadith that's going to come inshallah ta'ala in the future. But generally speaking, that which is haram is very well known. In fact, in the Quran, there's multiple ayahs in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ رَبِّي. It says, come, let me recite to you that which I have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. It says, قُلْ تَعَالَوْا أَتْلُوا مَا حَرَّمَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَيْكُمْ. In the surah, it says, come, I will recite to you what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden upon you. And then the verses continue, and he mentions that which is haram. And basically it summarizes and really covers almost every haram thing that's out there. They're that limited, you can count how many there are. Which means, beyond this, there are a lot of other issues that are actually completely allowed and permissible within Islam. And a lot of people tend to look at more that which is impermissible, because of these biases, that psychological thing, where if I tell you, don't do something, you want to do it. If I tell you, don't think about this, you're going to be thinking about it. Like to the person, don't think about a circle, what immediately pops into his head? The circle, because I told him not to think about it, and now he's thinking about it. So by making something haram or calling attention to it, yes, we're also saying that it's forbidden and a person shouldn't do it. That brings us to the third category, which are the hudud, the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These boundaries are just that. Red lines, we shouldn't cross them. We shouldn't go beyond them. And it's very important for the Muslim to realize where these boundaries are. Now these could be seen as the same thing as haram, but this is actually a broader category of just haram, because there are many hudud in the fara'id as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when talking about inheritance, He says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. These are the boundaries of Allah. When talking about inheritance, that's how to distribute it. But He says, these are the boundaries of Allah. Don't go beyond them. When talking about divorce, in ayat al-talaq, He says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. He says, these are the boundaries of Allah. Do not go beyond them. Right? In marriage, same thing. تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَعْتَدُوهَا. It seems to be in a lot of these cases, so marriage, divorce, inheritance, there are boundaries that are set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And especially, now there's other areas in which there are boundaries as well. We know them. But I want to mention these three. Why? Because generally speaking, people think that these are private affairs and you can get away with transgressions. You can get away with crossing the line. And people generally feel wronged personally, or there's an emotional issue that causes them to actually transgress these boundaries. And people tend to, in divorce, they tend to want to be vengeful and spiteful, and they tend to want to hurt the other person, and so they want to transgress those boundaries. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to remind them, don't go beyond these bounds. Same thing in inheritance. People would love to, if they could, to take the inheritance of their relatives. This happens. We've seen it. Unfortunately, it happens too often. Alhamdulillah, there are many Muslims who fear Allah and they would never transgress those boundaries. And these are the Muslims that are saved. These are the Muslims that follow the limits of Allah, the boundaries that Allah has set. But there are many Muslims that if there weren't boundaries, they would take away the inheritance of their sisters, their daughters, their brothers, their sons, whoever, just because of a disrespect or a moment of anger or a word, or he didn't call me when I was sick, or he didn't visit me when this, or I asked him for this and he didn't, over sometimes petty things, wallahi. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts these boundaries, because these are really, these are the essence of our society. Imagine if people started to transgress and it wasn't really that big of a deal, then it would have a problem. And so these boundaries set by Allah, these red lines, are meant so that we do not cross them. The word boundaries, hududullah, is also mentioned in that famous hadith that's narrated in Muslim Imam Ahmad and in Nasa'i and in Tirmidhi and others, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he says, ضرب الله مثلا للصراط المستقيم, where Allah has put an example of the straight path. And he mentions the straight path here, it's like a broad, we think of a path as being something very narrow. But in this hadith, it seems to be very broad. It's like an open, it's like a street, like a boulevard. Think of, it's a really wide road. It's hard to get lost and off the road unless you intentionally get off this road, this path. And then he says, and on the side there are hududullah. On the side of this road are the boundaries of Allah. Meaning if you cross the boundary, you're no longer on the road. And then in those boundaries, there are these doors. And there are these curtains hanging. And those are muharramat. Those are the specifically haram things. So here the boundaries of Allah is this larger concept than just things that are haram. Things that are haram are specific doors that a person might take off this big boulevard, right? Little detours. But the whole thing is covered by boundaries. And if you understand the boundaries, inside here is halal, outside is haram, then generally you're okay. You understand, you stay within the boundaries, you stay within your lane, so to speak. And then he says, if you get to one of those doors in the hadith, don't open it, because if you open it, you're going to go through. Which tells us that the haram you shouldn't even get close to. This is why so many verses that talk about those things that are haram, you shouldn't even approach them. This is why when he talks about alcohol, he says, فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ, leave it, avoid it. He doesn't even say, huwa haram. He says, avoid it. This is why there are 9 categories with regards to alcohol that are haram. The 9 categories. So we have to stay away from these types of things. So those are the boundaries, the hudud. Now of course there's a specific phenomenon known as hudud in Islam, and those are the prescribed punishments for specific acts that a person does. The hudud, there's a had for qadf, for false accusations of a person's honor. Right? There's the had of zina, there's the had of sariqah, there's the had of this and that. Meaning these are the prescribed punishments. It seems to be the case, and every scholar, the shurrah that I've seen, have said that's not what's meant in this hadith. He's not talking just about the hudud as the famously known hudud, meaning the prescribed punishments, but he's talking about these boundaries that are set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within the religion. to not transgress them. And yes, those prescribed punishments are boundaries as well, which means that they're boundaries that you shouldn't get close to those acts that lead them there, but they're also boundaries in the sense that you cannot punish a person more than that either, which is why many of the companions in later generations, when they found a person, for example, like stealing or committing zina, they never did the punishment more than what the Prophet ﷺ had prescribed. Which also leads to the idea that if a person drinks alcohol, what's the had in Islam? And in fact, there are some scholars who said the had is either 40 or 80, depending on whose opinion you look at. But many of the scholars on the opposite side said if it was a had, it would be very specific and there would be no two opinions. And the companions themselves would have never done other than that which the Prophet ﷺ did, which is 40. The Prophet ﷺ lashed a person 40 lashes. And it turns out that perhaps this is a more correct opinion, that it's not a had, وَإِنَّمَا هُوَ ta'zir, meaning he did it as the Prophet ﷺ was trying to do it as a prescribed punishment for that specific scenario, but it also means that any judge or any leader afterwards can prescribe whatever they see fit for that situation as well. So it has its own issue. So this leads us to the last category, inshallah ta'ala, which is al-maskut anhu, the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was quiet about, and the Prophet ﷺ was quiet about. And the issue of searching. And this is perhaps the more controversial one, where he says, ذَرُونِ مَا تَرَكْتُكُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ says in another hadith. In fact, the cause of this hadith was the Prophet ﷺ gathers the people and he says, indeed, إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ فَرَضَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْحَجِّ فَحُجُّوا. Indeed, Allah has now mandated Hajj upon you, so go to Hajj. فَحُجُّوا. And that's all he said. He said, go to Hajj. One of the people that were there, in fact his name is Aqra ibn Habis, he was the leader of his tribe. He came and he asked a very, I'm trying to think of what's the polite way to say, it's not an appropriate question. Let's just put it that way. And he says, أَوَ كُلَّ عَامٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. And the Prophet سكت. سكت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فسأل مرة أخرى أو كل عام يا رسول الله, every year يا رسول الله. And the Prophet was quiet. Then he asks the third, أو كل عام يا رسول الله. And then the Prophet looks at Al-Aqra and he says, لو قلت نعم لوجبت. If I said yes, then it would be such, meaning you would have to actually do it. And then he says, ذروني ما تركتكم. Leave me alone as much as I leave you alone. If I'm not specifying how often, don't ask. Leave it alone. Sometimes people, and the thing is, if you think about his question, it's a really dumb question. And I don't think the person actually thought about his question and what it entails. Like, why would you ask every year? Did the Prophet say every year? No, he didn't. He just said, go to Hajj. And this person is asking as if he wants to make it every year so that he has to go every year. But imagine if it was, and there was a year that he couldn't. Now he's sinful, but only sinful because he couldn't do what he asked to do. Why are you asking to do something when you can't even do it? It's as if we want to intentionally make the religion difficult upon ourselves, right, out of a sense of religiosity when it was never meant to be that difficult. This is why the Prophet was quiet, trying to see if this guy is going to be quiet. He wasn't. He asked again. He asked a third time, and then the Prophet teaches him a lesson. He says, look, if I say yes, you would have to go every year. وَلَمَا اسْتَطَعْتَ. And he says, you wouldn't be able to. So then why are you asking? Don't ask. Because you don't have intention of even replying what you're asking about. Those are the types of questions that really, as Muslims, we really shouldn't ask. And we get these types of things, not all the time, but some people ask questions and I was like, did you really think about your question before you asked it? Many times they didn't. And then after this, the Prophet ﷺ lays down a very important idea. He says, ذَرُونِ مَا تَرَكْتُكُمْ. Leave me alone as long as I'm quiet. Right? I leave you alone. Meaning in terms of legislating. فَإِنَّمَا هَلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ بِكَثْرَةِ سُؤَالِهِمْ وَاخْتِلَافِهِمْ عَلَى أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ. Indeed, the only thing that halaka, meaning it destroyed the people before you, is asking too many questions, meaning they're nagging questions. They're not even actual legit questions. and then them differing with their prophets, not even liking the answer that they're getting. They're just asking really dumb questions. And if you look, like, for example, in Surat Al-Baqarah, I mean, there's so many examples of this, but in Surat Al-Baqarah, the whole name of the surah is from the incident of Al-Baqarah, and you can see that from Bani Israel and what they did. Asking incessant questions. And Musa just told them, do this, keep it simple. If they had slaughtered any cow in the beginning, when Allah first told them through their own prophet, just slaughter any, it would have sufficed. Any cow would have sufficed. But they made it hard on themselves. And that's the whole point. Sometimes we become too incessant on knowing the details, when if Allah is quiet about the details, don't worry about it. Imagine if I tell somebody, go buy a car. And the person's like, okay, what car? Just any car. Really, just any car? Okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then you find he puts himself in such a narrow position that he's looking for a car that can't be found. In buying, there are people who are like this, where they're too, their anxiety, whatever's going on in their mind, their nervousness, etc., causes them to limit themselves to such an extent where they don't even do what they were seeking out to do to begin with. And now they're paralyzed in not being able to do that which is right. Just go out and buy a car, man. If you don't know, go ask a person who knows cars. He'll help you find a really good one. Asking an expert, a person of knowledge. After this, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, فَإِنَّمَا هَلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ بِكَثْرَةِ السُّؤَالِ وَاخْتِلَافِ عَلَى أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ. And then he says, فَإِذَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ وَإِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِأَمْرٍ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. He puts down a really hard rule. It's a hard rule, but it's actually very easy to apply. He says, look, if I forbid you from something, فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ, stay away from it. But if I command you to do something, do from it as much as you can. عَلَى الْإِسْتِطَاعَةِ. Worship as much as you can. Do good as much as you can. It's up to your own ability. You know yourself better than I do. But if I forbid you from something, just stay away from it. Wallahi, it is that simple. So what are the types of questions that are not recommended? Because here's the thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in another verse, a person could be confused. It says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. Which means that we are commanded to ask the people of knowledge when we ourselves don't know something. But at the same time here, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, don't ask too many questions. Allah Himself is saying, أَمْ تُرِيدُونَ أَن تَسْأَلُوا رَسُولَكُمْ كَمَا سُئِلَ مُوسَى مِن قَبْلِ. Or do you want to ask your messenger, meaning Muhammad ﷺ, just as Musa was asked before, meaning these frequent, incessant, unnecessary questions. What do you want to do? And there are people who ask unnecessary questions. Questions that if they thought about it for just 2 seconds, they would realize this isn't really applicable. So, these are questions like hypotheticals. What if, ya Shaykh, 1, 2, and 3? Ya akhi, don't. If it didn't happen, don't worry about it. If it's not happening now, don't worry about it. And this is why if you look at the questions of the Sahaba, they would always ask questions that were relevant to them, that were relevant to their situation, that actually applied to them. Sometimes things would happen, and instead of asking questions, the Sahaba realized it's better just leave it alone. If the Prophet wants to say something, he'll say. Because the Prophet is not a person to be quiet about injustice or to be quiet about something that's wrong. So for example, we have a hadith in which Asma bint Abi Bakr radiyallahu anhuma, she says, the time of the Prophet ﷺ, while the Prophet was alive, we were in a situation and we slaughtered a horse and we ate it. We slaughtered a horse and we ate it. But nothing was told to us regarding that action. What is she saying? She's saying we never went to the Prophet ﷺ to explicitly ask him, but on the same time, the Prophet ﷺ never came to us explicitly to tell us whether it's halal or haram. Which means, generally speaking, we took it that it's okay. And that's actually the predominant ruling. There are some scholars who said it's makruh, and they specifically mention that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala differentiates. He says, وَمِنْهَا رَكُوبُهُمْ وَمِنْهَا يَأْكُلُونَ. That means there are some animals that they ride, some animals that they eat. Which means that generally speaking, if it's an animal that you ride, you shouldn't eat it. And if it's an animal that you eat, that you shouldn't ride it. Now that makes sense. However, there are animals that break this rule, like a camel. A camel, its meat is great, and riding it is also great. And so you can do whatever you want with that type of animal. Okay? But there are things that break the mold, and that's why there are scholars who said that eating horse is makruh. So, going back, al-maskut anhu, these things that are that Islam, yani meaning the Quran itself, is quiet about, or the Prophet ﷺ himself is quiet about. What does that mean to us? Generally speaking, it means that it's halal, it's okay, it's permissible. Now, if they're quiet about it because it didn't exist, this is a different case. Then we have to ask about it, we have to find out. If it's something that is well known that there's no way that this could be haram, don't worry about it. But there are some people who unfortunately might get confused or think, and there's something in there that actually isn't there. What's interesting is that in the version not of Ad-Dar al-Qutni but of others, this same hadith, it is mentioned that the reason why the companion narrated this hadith is because he was asked about cheese, jubun, that was brought from Persia to them. It was Persian cheese, and it was brought to them, and they were asking about it. Is this cheese halal or haram? This is a question that we get all the time about foods. And people ask, oh, because it's not meat. And if it was meat, khalas, it would be like, no, it has to be properly slaughtered, etc. But it's cheese. And they brought it. Is this cheese halal or haram? They didn't know. And so the companion narrates this hadith as if telling them, just eat it. Don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. It's cheese, it's milk. What's going to be in it? As if to tell him that this is actually something that is quiet, meaning as if the Prophet ﷺ was indicating to them this as well. In some narrations it mentions that the Prophet himself was gifted cheese, and when the people asked, they said it was Persian. So in some versions it says that the Prophet ﷺ himself was going through this, and then he tells them اقطعوه بالسكين وسموا. طبعا يعني التسمية, he says just cut it with your own knife and eat and say Bismillah before you eat. Not as if this is like dhabiha now, you're doing dhabh, but to say Bismillah aslan before you eat anything. But that seems to be the weaker version. The more stronger version is that it was the companions who got the cheese. In fact, there's multiple narrations, and some of them mention Abdullah ibn Umar, and some of them mention other Sahaba who were actually brought these types of foods. In some narrations it mentions that it was talking about the fur. So they were brought fur clothing, and it was also from non-Muslim lands. And they were asked about it. Can I wear this fur clothing? And he narrates this hadith as if to tell them it's fine. Don't worry about it. How do you know? And then some of them actually mention that the Prophet ﷺ wore clothes that were made in non-Muslim lands, and some of them were made out of leather, and some of them had fur, and the Prophet ﷺ did nothing. He didn't ask, oh, how did you slaughter this animal that was used in the fur? He didn't ask that. How did you guys make this leather, the tanning? Because sometimes they use haram substances for tanning. The Muslims didn't, but some other places that actually use urine and other stuff like this, it would smell terrible to tan the leather. This is why tanning leather usually was done at the outskirts of a lot of these towns, because it smelled terrible. Because they were using actually urine to tan the leather. Never did the Prophet ﷺ ask, how was this leather made, if it was brought from a non-Muslim land, which generally speaking means that it's not a big deal. Yakhid, why are you making it a big deal? And unfortunately, we live in a day and age when people make a big deal out of small things, and the actual major things are ignoring. And I'll tell you guys a story, inshallah ta'ala, and then we'll end with this, because I know it's time for salah. There was a guy who called me. It was almost midnight. This was back in the day when I used to answer late call, and now I don't. I just turn off my phone and I'm not answering. This guy called me. It's almost midnight. And he's like, Sheikh, Ana Muhammad Fulan. That was his name. He's like, I'm Muhammad so-and-so. I'm like, Ahlan wa sahlan. I don't know who he is. And he could tell that I don't know who he is. And he's like, Ana jibt raqamak min fulan. I got your phone number from so-and-so. I'm like, I don't know who he is either. Tayyib, what's going on? He said, Sheikh, I'm at this place right now, and they're serving pizza, and I want to know if the pizza is haram or not, if it's halal or not. And I said, okay. He's speaking to me in Arabic. قلت له, okay, sure. Mesh. And what's on the pizza? Is it like pepperoni? Is that what you're asking? He's like, no, it's cheese pizza. But I want to know if cheese pizza is okay. And I said, why would cheese pizza not be okay? And then he said, because, sometimes they use al-qiha, so this is the rennet in English, that's extracted from other animals to use to coagulate the cheese. The way that you make cheese is that you have to get that protein. It's an enzyme that's extracted. That's if it's a natural one. You can actually buy the artificial one now and it's fine. But if they extracted the natural one, they would generally get it from the stomachs of other animals, and it's just a small part, this enzyme, and it helps turn the milk into cheese while they're processing it and whatnot. Small, tiny amount. Al-anfiha, this is what they call it. طبعا, I knew this, but I'm surprised that this guy knows it. I'm like, okay, sure. You're talking about the rennet, and you're afraid that maybe they got it from somewhere else. He's like, yeah. So maybe they got it from pig. Is that your question? He's like, yes, maybe they got it from pork. طيب. So I said, okay. Let me ask you this. Right now it's almost midnight. He said, yeah. He said, generally speaking, if they're serving pizza at a function that's after midnight, it's typically not a business function. This is probably a party. And he was quiet. I said, typically there's probably music, alcohol, intermixing, there's girls, there's other things. He was completely quiet. And I told him, look, brother, are you hungry? Like, is it a necessity? He said, no, it's not a necessity. And could you go home and eat? He said, yeah. So I said, why are you worried then? He's like, but I just want to know. I'm like, look, I think you have much bigger things to worry about than whether this type of thing is this. Number one. Number two, if you want the answer to the question, I told him actually many scholars have said that al-anfiha la tadurru min masdariha, meaning it's not a problem from wherever you get it from. Many scholars have this opinion. In fact, Abdullah ibn Umar is on record saying, even if you know that he got it from a pig, because it's such a minute amount, it doesn't matter. And they were brought cheese, like I said in the example that we mentioned, they brought cheese from Persia and from all these other places. And he said, eat, say Bismillah, and don't even worry about it. And don't ask, don't be too technical to where you make life difficult upon yourself. If they bring you, it's cheese, it's fine, you don't need to ask. So there's a lot of categories like this. And once the brother heard my answer, and I told him, I think you have more things to worry about at the place that you are than about the cheese pizza. You can eat at home if you want to, inshallah ta'ala, but I think it would be better for you to go home anyways, correct? And he said, yeah, you're right, Sheikh. So, okay, thank you. So he ended up hanging up. I don't know if he ate the pizza or not. I never talked to that guy again. At least I don't know if I did, because I don't know who he was. Anyways, this whole idea of understanding there are things that we should ask about, in which we're confused, it's legitimate, it's kada, but there are many things in which asking about them is actually making the religion more difficult upon yourself. And this is a very sensitive topic, and inshallah ta'ala maybe at another time we can expand on it more. Inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum. I know we went past the time a little bit, but we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He helps us and guides us and forgives us for our shortcomings and our sins. And inshallah ta'ala we will see you all next week bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallah wa hamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.